The galactic childcare station hung in space, like a particularly optimistic middle finger extended toward the chaos of the Nexus war zone. Someone, somewhere, had decided that what this conflict-torn system really needed was a floating daycare center. Before we begin, YouTube shows me that 93% of you haven't subscribed yet. Subscribing is free, it really supports our community, and I'd love for you to be part of it. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Because nothing says, "We've got this under control," quite like parking a facility full of traumatized alien children directly in the path of ongoing interstellar warfare. Nora stepped off the transport shuttle and immediately wondered if her career counselor had been having a particularly vindictive day when they'd recommended this assignment. The station's corridors hummed with the kind of nervous energy that suggested everyone was just one emergency drill away from a complete nervous breakdown. "Welcome to Paradise Station," muttered the security guard, who barely glanced at Nora's credentials. His expression suggested he'd given up on life sometime around his third cup of synthetic coffee. "Try not to get eaten on your first day." How reassuring. The facility director, a harried-looking Zentarian with stress molts scattered across his blue-tinted skin, met Nora in what generously could be called a reception area. It looked more like a war room crossed with a medical triage center, complete with warning signs in 12 different languages and what appeared to be claw marks gouged into the metal walls. "You must be our new specialist," the director said, his voice carrying the particular strain of someone who'd been dealing with impossible situations for far too long. "I'm Director Keth. I hope you brought your own insurance policy." "That's encouraging," Nora replied, watching a maintenance droid frantically repair what looked like bite marks in a nearby wall panel. The job posting mentioned challenging cases, but this seems a bit extreme, even by galactic standards. Keth laughed, and it wasn't a sound filled with joy. "Challenging? Right. That's what we're calling it." He gestured down a corridor where the Dock 2 lights flickered intermittently. "Your predecessors called it other things. Most of those words aren't translatable in polite company." They walked past several standard childcare units where the soft sounds of various alien younglings playing, crying, or making those indefinable noises that children across the galaxy seem to specialize in, drifted through reinforced doors. These areas looked normal, cheerful, even. Colorful murals decorated the walls, and through observation windows, Nora could see children of various species engaged in what appeared to be typical childhood activities. Then, they reached the end of the corridor. The special cases wing was separated from the rest of the facility by what appeared to be blast doors. Actual blast doors, with warning lights, and a sign that read, "Authorized personnel only," in 17 languages, including 3 that were apparently just various combinations of skull emojis. "Let me guess," Nora said, eyeing the impressive security setup. "This is where you keep the difficult children." "Difficult?" Keth repeated the word like he was tasting something particularly bitter. "The Velari cubs aren't difficult. Difficult implies there's a solution that doesn't involve sedatives, restraints, or emergency evacuation protocols." He pressed his palm against a scanner, submitted to a retinal scan, and spoke his authorization code into a voice recognition system. The blast doors opened with a sound like a bank vault surrendering its secrets. The wing beyond was quieter than Nora had expected, but it was the kind of quiet that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The silence of predators waiting in the shadows. 3 of them, Keth continued, his voice dropping to what was probably intended to be a whisper, but came out more like the nervous muttering of someone trying to convince themselves they weren't about to be devoured. Qual, Nyx, and Vex. Their parents were killed in the Helix Nebula incident 3 months ago. Since then, he gestured helplessly at the reinforced walls, the scratch marks, and what appeared to be a hastily patched hole large enough for a small person to crawl through. "They're children," Nora pointed out, though even as she said it, she was beginning to understand why the previous staff had requested transfers to active war zones. How much damage could they possibly? A sound erupted from somewhere deeper in the wing. It wasn't quite a roar, wasn't quite a scream, and definitely wasn't the kind of noise that belonged in a childcare facility. It was followed by what sounded like furniture being systematically destroyed, and someone, probably a staff member, using language that would make a space pirate blush. "That much damage," Keth said grimly. "And that's during their calm period. You should see what they're like at night." Nora was beginning to suspect she'd be finding out whether she wanted to or not. They approached the Cubs' quarters, and Nora got her first glimpse of her new charges through a reinforced observation window. The Velari were impressive specimens, even as children. They moved with the fluid grace of born predators, all sleek fur patterns and eyes that seemed to track movement with unsettling precision. They were beautiful in the way that apex predators tended to be, right up until you remembered you were made of meat. Kal, the eldest, was clearly the leader of their little pack. He prowled the room with the confidence of someone who'd appointed himself the guardian of his younger siblings. His dark fur was marked with the silver streaks that indicated he was approaching adolescence, and his yellow eyes held an intelligence that was both impressive and slightly terrifying. Nyx, the middle cub, seemed to be the wild card of the group. Where Kal was calculated in his movements, Nyx was pure chaos energy, barely contained in a deceptively small package. They bounded from surface to surface with the kind of reckless energy that suggested the concept of consequences was more of a suggestion than a rule. And then there was Vex. The youngest cub sat in the corner, pressed against the wall with her knees drawn up to her chest. Her large eyes tracked every movement in the room, but she made no sound. According to the file Keth handed her, Vex hadn't spoken since arriving at the facility. The trauma of losing her parents had apparently locked her voice away somewhere deep inside. "The little one hasn't said a word," Keth confirmed, following Nora's gaze. "The other two, well, they make up for her silence, especially during the night shift." "What exactly happens during the night shift?" Nora asked, though she was fairly certain she didn't want to know the answer. Keth's stress molts increased. Velari are naturally nocturnal. In the wild, they hunt in packs during the dark hours. Here. He paused, watching Qual pace near the window. Here. They don't have prey to hunt, so they hunt everything else. Other children, staff members, furniture, the walls, each other. We've had to evacuate the entire wing 6 times in the past month. Surely there are protocols for dealing with traumatized predator species? Nora asked, though even as she said it, she realized how naive that sounded. The galaxy was full of species, and most of them hadn't been thoroughly studied by child psychologists. "The standard approaches don't work," Keth admitted. "Sedatives metabolize too quickly in their systems. Isolation makes them more aggressive. Group therapy sessions." He shuddered. "Let's just say the other children are now afraid of story time." As if summoned by their conversation, Qual's head snapped toward the observation window. His eyes locked onto Nora's with an intensity that made her take an involuntary step backward. It was like being evaluated by something that was deciding whether you were a threat. an ally, or lunch. The cub's lips pulled back in what might have been a smile on a grued-out, human child. On a Velthari, it revealed an impressive array of very sharp teeth. "He knows you're new," Keth noted unnecessarily. "They can smell fear, by the way, and uncertainty, and pretty much everything else about your emotional state. It's like having your feelings broadcast on an open channel." "Wonderful," Nora muttered, trying to project confidence while internally screaming. "What happened to my predecessors exactly?" The first one requested an immediate transfer after Nix decided to use her as a climbing tree. The second lasted 2 weeks before he had what I'm told was a very impressive nervous breakdown. The third. Keth paused. "Well, she's recovering nicely. The doctors say she should regain full use of her left arm within a few months." Nora stared at him. "They injured a staff member?" "Not intentionally," Keth said quickly. "They were playing. It's just that their idea of playing involves hunting behaviors, and humans are remarkably fragile when compared to Velthari prey animals. This was getting better by the minute. The facility board is putting pressure on me to find a solution," Keth continued, his voice taking on the desperate tone of someone whose job security was hanging by a thread. "If we can't manage these cubs within the next 48 hours, they're going to be transferred to a military detention facility. The kind where childcare involves security cells and automated feeding systems." The thought of those 3 traumatized children, because that's what they were, despite their predatory nature being locked away in some sterile military facility, made something twist unpleasantly in Nora's stomach. "That's not acceptable," she said firmly. "They're grieving children, not criminals. Try telling that to the families of the other children who are too terrified to sleep," Keth replied. "Or to the staff members who've requested hazard pay just to work the day shift." As if to emphasize his point, another crash echoed from the deal, Cubs's quarters, followed by what sounded like Nix celebrating the destruction of another piece of furniture. Nora took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and made a decision that would either save her career or end it spectacularly. "I'll take the night shift," she announced. "Starting tonight?" Keth stared at her like she'd just volunteered to wrestle a plasma cannon. "Are you certain? The night shift is when they're most active. Most predatory." "They're children," Nora repeated, though she wasn't entirely sure if she was trying to convince Keth or herself. "Traumatized, grieving children who've lost everything and been dumped in an alien environment where nothing makes sense anymore. If I can't help them, at least I can try to understand them." "Your funeral," Keth muttered, but there was something like relief in his voice. At least now the responsibility for whatever happened next wouldn't be entirely his. As they walked back toward the main facility, Nora couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. When she glanced back at the observation window, she caught sight of 3 pairs of eyes tracking her movements, with the focused attention of predators marking their territory. Or maybe, just maybe, 3 scared children wondering if this new human would be different from all the others who'd given up on them. Either way, Nora thought grimly, tonight was going to be very interesting indeed. Nora spent the remainder of her first day doing what any sensible person would do when faced with 3 potentially homicidal alien children. She hit the research databases like her life depended on it. Which, considering the claw marks she'd seen in the facility walls, it very well might. The Velthari species profile made for fascinating reading, assuming one enjoyed the kind of fascination that came with detailed descriptions of hunting techniques, pack hierarchies, and feeding behaviors that would give a horror novelist nightmares. They were apex predators, from a world where subtlety was a luxury and hesitation was a death sentence. Their children developed hunting instincts before they could walk properly, and their social structure was built around complex pack dynamics that made wolf behavior look like a casual book club. "Wonderful," Nora muttered, scrolling through a particularly cheerful section about territorial marking behaviors. No pressure. The more she read, the more she began to understand why traditional childcare methods had failed so spectacularly. Human approaches to child psychology were built around creatures that had evolved from tree-dwelling omnivores who solved problems through cooperation and communication. The Velari had evolved from something that solved problems by eating them. According to the files, Velari cubs were typically raised in extended family groups with clear hierarchical structures. The alpha pair provided guidance and protection, while older siblings helped establish boundaries and taught hunting techniques. When the cubs lost their parents, they hadn't just lost their caregivers, they'd lost their entire social framework. No wonder they were acting out. They were three traumatized predators, stuck in an environment that made no sense according to their evolutionary programming, surrounded by potential prey animals who kept trying to control them using methods that their instincts interpreted as weakness. As evening approached and the facility settled into its night routine, the day shift staff wished her luck with the kind of forced cheer normally reserved for terminal patients, and someone had thoughtfully left a first aid kit outside the blast doors. The night supervisor, a grizzled Altarian whose species was known for their practical approach to impossible situations, gave Nora a look that suggested he'd already written her obituary. "Standard protocol is to avoid direct contact unless absolutely necessary," he explained, handing her a comm unit and what appeared to be a personal shield generator. "If things go sideways, hit the emergency button and we'll initiate lockdown procedures." "What exactly constitutes things going sideways in this context?" Nora asked. The supervisor's facial tentacles twitched in what might have been amusement. "You'll know." The blast doors sealed behind her with a finality that did nothing for her confidence. The special wing felt different at night. More alive somehow, as if the darkness had awakened something that daylight kept dormant. Emergency lighting cast long shadows that seemed to shift and move when she wasn't looking directly at them. Nora approached the cubs' quarters and peered through the observation window. The room was dark, but she could see three pairs of eyes reflecting the corridor lights, like golden coins floating in the blackness. They were awake, alert, and very clearly aware of her presence. She'd planned to start slowly, perhaps just sitting outside their room, letting them get used to her scent and presence. It was a sensible, cautious approach that took into account their predatory nature and traumatized state. That plan lasted approximately 30 seconds. A sound from deeper in the wing made her blood freeze, a cry of fear that was distinctly non-Velari. Nora ran toward the source, her footsteps echoing off the metal floors, and found chaos in the common area. Somehow, the three cubs had escaped their supposedly secure quarters and were engaged in what could generously be called play with two other refugee children. A young Zephyrian was pressed against the wall, her crystalline features flickering with terror, while a small Corden boy had climbed onto a table and was throwing anything he could reach at Qual, who was stalking toward him with predatory focus. Nyx was bouncing between the walls like a furry missile, their excitement feeding off the fear in the room, while Vex sat in the corner, watching the proceedings with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. "Hey!" Nora shouted, stepping into the room with more authority than she felt. "What's going on here?" Three Velari heads swiveled toward her with mechanical precision. For a moment, the room went completely silent, except for the terrified breathing of the other children. Then Qual did something that made Nora's training kick into high gear. He positioned himself between her and his siblings, his body language shifting into what was unmistakably a protective stance, not aggressive, but ready to become aggressive if she posed a threat to his pack. "Nobody move," she said quietly, though whether she was talking to the cubs or the other children wasn't entirely clear. "Everyone stay calm." Nix, apparently interpreting "stay calm" as a challenge, launched themselves at the nearest wall with a sound that was part purr, part battle cry. They ricocheted off the surface and landed on a shelf, sending containers crashing to the floor in a symphony of destruction. The noise triggered something in Qual. His pupils dilated, his lips pulled back to reveal those impressive teeth. And suddenly, Nora was looking at a predator who'd decided that the situation required action. He lunged. Not at the other children, she realized with a shock at her. But it wasn't an attack. At the last second, he twisted and placed himself between Nora and Nix, who had been preparing for another ricocheting adventure that would have taken them directly into the Zephyrian child. "You're protecting them," Nora breathed, understanding flooding through her like cold water. "All of them." Qual's eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw past the predatory exterior to the scared, grieving child underneath. He was trying to keep his pack together while also protecting the weaker members of their impromptu group, but he didn't know how to do it in a way that didn't terrify everyone involved. "It's okay," she said softly, crouching down to put herself at his eye level. "I understand. You're trying to keep everyone safe." The other children took advantage of the momentary calm to flee the room, leaving Nora alone with 3 Velari cubs who were watching her with expressions that seemed to be evaluating whether she was a threat, an ally, or something else entirely. The next few hours were educational. Nora quickly learned that standard human childcare techniques weren't just ineffective with Velari cubs, they were actively counterproductive. Attempts at timeouts were interpreted as territorial challenges. Gentle redirection was seen as weakness. Traditional comfort measures, like soft voices and slow movements, triggered their hunting instincts. By midnight, the common area looked like a war zone. 2 more pieces of furniture had been reduced to component parts, and Nora was beginning to understand why her predecessors had requested transfers to active combat zones. But she was also beginning to see patterns in their behavior. Qual wasn't randomly destructive. He was testing boundaries, trying to establish a territory that his pack could defend. Nix's apparent chaos had purpose behind it. They were mapping the environment, learning every surface and hiding spot in case retreat became necessary. And Vex, silent Vex, was watching everything with the focused attention of someone gathering intelligence. They weren't being malicious, they were being Velari. Around 2 in the morning, exhaustion finally started to show on the cubs. Their movements became less frantic. Their constant vigilance began to flag. Qual's attempts to maintain his protective perimeter grew half-hearted, and even Nix settled into a relatively stationary position on top of a supply cabinet. That's when Nora tried something desperate. Instead of trying to control them or redirect their behavior, she sat down in the middle of the destroyed common area and did absolutely nothing. She didn't try to clean up the mess, didn't attempt to coax them into their quarters, didn't speak or move or do anything that could be interpreted as either threatening or submissive. She just existed in their space. The cubs' reaction was immediate and fascinating. Their hyper-vigilant alertness shifted to confusion. Qual approached cautiously, circling her at a distance that kept him ready to retreat or attack. Nix dropped down from their perch and began stalking around the room's perimeter. but their movements were curious rather than chaotic. And Vex, silent, traumatized, Vex crept closer with the hesitant steps of someone who wanted to trust but had forgotten how. "You don't know what to do with me, do you?" Nora said quietly, not moving from her position. "I'm not trying to control you. I'm not running away. And I'm not challenging your authority. I'm just here." Qual stopped his circling and tilted his head, those intelligent eyes studying her with new interest. His body language shifted almost imperceptibly, still alert, but no longer defensive. That's when Nora had her breakthrough moment. The cubs weren't refusing to follow rules because they were rebellious or traumatized, though they were certainly both. They were refusing to follow rules because the rules didn't make sense in their cultural context. Human childcare was built around cooperation and communication. Velthari's social structure was built around clear hierarchies and respect for strength. They weren't looking for someone to control them. They were looking for someone strong enough to lead them. But strength, in Velthari terms, didn't mean physical dominance or authoritarian control. It meant the kind of calm confidence that came from knowing your place in the pack and being secure enough in that position to protect those under your care. The revelation was so obvious that Nora almost laughed out loud. She'd been approaching them like a human trying to manage difficult human children. What she needed to do was approach them like a potential pack leader, earning the respect of young predators. The only problem was that she had absolutely no idea how to do that without getting herself killed in the process. As if sensing her thoughts, Khal took a step closer. His golden eyes were fixed on her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle. But there was something different in his expression now. Not hostility, not submission, but evaluation. He was giving her a chance to prove herself worthy of his trust. The question was, how exactly did one earn the respect of a traumatized alien predator without ending up as their midnight snack? Outside the windows, the war zone continued its distant, deadly dance among the stars. But inside the common area of the Special Cases Wing, a human childcare specialist and 3 grieving Velthari cubs were about to begin a very different kind of battle, one where the weapons were trust and understanding, and the stakes were nothing less than the definition of family itself. The answer came to Nora at approximately 3 in the morning, during what she would later describe as either a moment of brilliant inspiration or a complete mental breakdown. The cubs had settled into a wary triangle around her, close enough to react if she proved threatening, far enough to escape if necessary. It was like being the center of a very tense, very furry standoff. That's when she remembered something from her xenoanthropology courses, something about the universal nature of narrative across sentient species. Every intelligent race they'd encountered had some form of storytelling tradition. Stories were how cultures passed down knowledge, taught survival skills, and established social bonds. More importantly, stories were how pack leaders in many species taught young hunters about the world and their place in it. It was either going to work, or she was about to become the galaxy's first documented case of death by children's literature. "Once upon a time," Nora began, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "There were 3 young hunters who lived in the deep forests of a world where the suns never set. 3 pairs of golden eyes locked onto her with laser-like focus." Khal's head tilted slightly, his ears pricking forward with interest. Nyx stopped their restless movement entirely, freezing in place like a statue. And Vex, silent. Traumatized Vex, actually shifted closer, drawn by something in Nora's tone. "These weren't ordinary hunters," Nora continued, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence that human storytellers had used for millennia. They were the children of the greatest pack leaders their world had ever known. The eldest was called Qualveth the Fierce. If Qual's ears could have perked up any higher, they would have achieved orbit. His golden eyes widened with what was unmistakably surprise and delight at hearing his name woven into the tale. The middle hunter was Nyx Ara the Swift. Nora went on, watching as the cub in question practically vibrated with excitement. And the youngest was Vexlin, the Silent, who spoke with actions rather than words, and whose quiet wisdom guided the pack through the darkest of times. Vex made a sound barely audible, almost more of a breath than a vocalization, but it was the first sound she'd made since arriving at the facility. Progress. Now. Nora continued, settling into the story like putting on comfortable clothes. These 3 hunters had faced a terrible tragedy. Their pack leaders, the great Velma and Thar OK, had been taken by the shadow beasts that plagued the endless forest. The 3 young hunters were left alone, scared, and angry at a world that no longer made sense. The cubs had moved closer, without seeming to realize it. Qual was now sitting directly in front of her, his predatory stillness replaced by the rapt attention of a child hearing about adventures. Nyx had settled into a crouch nearby, their tail twitching with barely contained energy. And Vex? Vex had crept close enough that Nora could see the silver flecks in her fur, the intelligence burning in those young eyes. The forest around them was full of strange creatures. Nora continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that made all 3 cubs lean forward. Some were prey animals, weak and frightened. Others were different kinds of hunters, with their own ways of surviving. But none of them understood the way of the true hunters, the way that Qualveth, Nyx Ara, and Vexilin had been taught. She paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to build tension. It was a technique as old as storytelling itself, and it worked on alien predators just as well as it did on human children. The other creatures in the forest were afraid of the 3 hunters, she said, her voice carrying a note of sadness that seemed to resonate with her audience. They didn't understand that hunting wasn't about cruelty. It was about strength, protection, and the ancient bonds that held packs together. They saw the hunters' sharp teeth and thought, danger. They saw their quick movements and thought, threat. They didn't see the fear and sadness that lived behind those golden eyes. Qual made a soft sound in his throat, not quite a whimper, but close. It was the sound of someone recognizing their own story being told back to them. So, the 3 young hunters did what seemed natural, Nora continued. They hunted. They stalked. They showed their strength to a forest full of creatures who didn't understand that this was how they expressed love, how they protected those who couldn't protect themselves. She looked directly at each cub as she spoke, making sure they understood that this wasn't just a story, it was their story, told in a way that honored their nature instead of trying to change it. But the other forest dwellers didn't understand, she said, her voice taking on a note of gentle wisdom. They saw the hunting behavior and thought it meant harm. They scattered and hid, leaving the 3 hunters more alone than ever. And so, the hunters grew more fierce, more desperate, trying harder and harder to make the others understand their good intentions. Nyx let out a soft trill of what sounded like agreement. Even they could see the futility in that approach. The 3 hunters might have spent forever trapped in this cycle, Nora said, growing lonelier and more misunderstood with each passing day. But then, something changed. A new creature came to the forest, one who had traveled far and seen many different kinds of hunters. She paused again, meeting Qual's eyes directly. The young predator was hanging on every word, his entire body language suggesting that he was waiting to hear how this impossible situation could possibly resolve. This new creature, let's call her. The wanderer didn't run when she saw the three hunters. She didn't try to tame them or change them or make them into something they weren't. Instead, she sat down in their territory and said, "I see you. I see your strength, your loyalty, your love for each other. And I want to understand." Vex shifted closer still, close enough now that Nora could have reached out and touched her if she dared. The youngest cub's eyes were fixed on Nora's face with an intensity that was both heartbreaking and humbling. The wanderer had a gift, Nora continued, her voice taking on the warm tones of revelation. She could speak the language of stories, the universal tongue that all hunters understood, whether they stalked through forests or swam through deep waters or flew through endless skies. And in this language, she began to tell the three hunters about other young predators who had faced similar challenges. She launched into a series of interconnected tales, stories about brave hunters who learned to channel their strength for protection rather than destruction, who found new families among the most unlikely companions. With each story, the cubs relaxed a little more. Qual's defensive posture melted into simple attention. Nyx's restless energy focused into stillness. And Vex's miracle of miracles began to make soft sounds of agreement and interest. But the most important thing the wanderer taught them, Nora said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, was that being a hunter didn't mean being alone. The strongest packs were those that included different kinds of creatures, some who hunted, some who gathered, some who healed, some who built. But from protecting the vulnerable and teaching the young, she wove in elements she'd hastily researched about Velari culture, their pack structures, their coming-of-age rituals, their concepts of honor and responsibility. But she also included human elements, universal themes of family and belonging that transcended species boundaries. As the night wore on, Nora found herself adapting the stories in real time, responding to the cubs' reactions and needs. When Qual seemed troubled by a tale of leadership challenges, she emphasized the wisdom of seeking counsel from trusted advisors. When Nyx grew restless, she added action sequences that channeled their energy into imaginative adventures. And when Vex seemed overwhelmed, she included quiet heroes whose greatest strength came from their ability to observe and understand. The stories began to interconnect, forming a complex narrative web that addressed trauma, loss, family, and hope. Without directly mentioning their situation, Nora was giving the cubs a framework for understanding their experiences and a vision of how their story might continue. Somewhere around dawn, she noticed that Qual's breathing had become slow and regular. The young pack leader had finally allowed himself to truly relax, trusting in the security of the narrative space they'd created together. Nyx had curled into a ball nearby. Their usual frantic energy finally settled into peaceful rest. And Vex. Vex had moved close enough to rest her head against Nora's leg. The contact was light, tentative, but it was there. Trust, offered like a fragile gift from a child who had forgotten what safety felt like. "And so?" Nora whispered, her voice barely audible in the pre-dawn quiet. "The three hunters learned that the greatest adventures weren't about conquest or dominance. They were about finding your pack, protecting those you love, and discovering that strength shared is strength multiplied." As the first artificial dawn began to filter through the station's windows, Nora looked down at three sleeping Velari cubs and realized that something fundamental had shifted. They weren't just predators anymore, or just traumatized refugees, or just problem cases to be managed. They were her pack. And she, somehow, had become their alpha, not through dominance or control, but through the simple act of seeing them for who they truly were, and telling them stories that honored their nature while showing them a path forward. The only question now was whether this fragile new bond would survive the harsh light of day, and whether the rest of the facility would understand that sometimes the best way to tame a predator isn't to break their spirit. It's to give them something worth protecting. But for now, in the quiet peace of the Special Cases Wing, 3 cubs slept safely for the first time in months, and a human storyteller kept watch over dreams filled with heroes who looked remarkably like themselves. Director Keth found them at dawn, one human, surrounded by 3 sleeping Velari cubs in what remained of the common area. His stress molts were working overtime as he took in the scene. Overturned furniture, scattered supplies, and what appeared to be claw marks in previously pristine walls. Then he noticed something that made him stop mid-panic. The cubs weren't just sleeping, they were sleeping peacefully. Qual had positioned himself between Nora and the door, even in sleep, maintaining his protective instincts. Nyx was curled into a compact ball of fur, their usual restless energy finally at rest. And Vex silent. Traumatized Vex was pressed against Nora's side like she belonged there. "What did you do?" Keth whispered, his voice filled with the kind of awe normally reserved for witnessing impossible miracles. "I told them stories," Nora replied quietly, careful not to disturb her sleeping charges. "Stories about hunters who learned that the greatest strength comes from protecting others." Over the following days, a remarkable transformation took place. The nightly chaos that had terrorized the facility for months simply stopped. Instead of destructive rampages, the Special Cases Wing echoed with the soft murmur of Nora's voice, weaving tales of adventure and belonging. But it wasn't just the cubs who were changing. Word of Nora's success spread through the facility like wildfire, and soon other caregivers were quietly observing her storytelling sessions. What they witnessed challenged everything they thought they knew about interspecies childcare. The stories weren't just entertainment, they were therapy, education, and cultural bridge building, all wrapped into one. Nora had somehow found a way to honor the cubs' predatory nature while teaching them how to exist peacefully in a multi-species environment. The real test came on their 5th night together. Nora was midway through a particularly engaging tale about a young hunter who learned to lead by example when every alarm in the facility suddenly began screaming. Emergency lights bathed the corridors in pulsing red, and the facility's automated voice announced what every parent's nightmare sounded like. "Security breach detected. Unauthorized vessels approaching. All personnel to emergency stations." The cubs' reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of panicking or becoming aggressive, they moved with coordinated precision that spoke to their predatory heritage. Qual positioned himself between the door and his siblings, his body language shifting into protective mode. Nyx began scanning the room for alternate exits and defensive positions. And Vex, remarkable Vex, actually spoke for the first time in months. "Nora," she whispered, her voice barely audible but crystal clear. "Are we safe?" Before Nora could answer, Qual's head snapped toward the ventilation system. His enhanced hearing had detected something that human ears couldn't pick up: the sound of movement in the air ducts above their heads. "Someone's in the vents," he said quietly, his first direct communication with Nora. "Multiple someones. They smell wrong." That's when Nora realized something that sent ice through her veins. The cubs hadn't just been acting out during their first months at the facility, they'd been trying to warn everyone about threats that only their predatory senses could detect. Their hunting of other children hadn't been aggression. It had been protection. The facility had been infiltrated before, and the cubs had been the only ones to notice. How many? Nora asked, trusting their senses completely. Nix tilted their head, listening intently. At least 6, maybe more. They're moving toward the main childcare units. The other children? Hundreds of vulnerable refugee younglings who had no idea that danger was creeping through the walls above their heads. We have to warn them, Nora said. But even as she spoke, she knew that the facility's communication systems had been compromised. The intruders had cut the main lines. That's why the automated warnings had stopped. That's when Cal did something that proved beyond any doubt that Nora's stories had taken root in fertile ground. We hunt, he said simply, but not for prey, for pack. What followed was the most unconventional rescue operation in the history of interstellar childcare. The 3 cubs moved through the facility's maintenance corridors with lethal grace. Their natural hunting instincts now focused on protecting rather than pursuing. Nora followed, armed with nothing but a calm unit and absolute faith in her unlikely pack. They moved like shadows given purpose, the cubs' enhanced senses guiding them around the intruders, while Nora used her access codes to evacuate sleeping children from their quarters. It was slow, careful work. Moving hundreds of younglings without alerting the infiltrators required patience and precision that tested everyone's nerves. But it worked. Room by room, corridor by corridor, they managed to guide the refugee children to the facility's secure emergency shelters while the cubs tracked the movements of their uninvited guests. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. The intruders, a group of war profiteers looking to kidnap refugee children for ransom, expected to find helpless victims and overwhelmed staff. What they found instead was 3 Velari cubs who had decided that these strangers posed a threat to their extended pack. The fight lasted approximately 30 seconds. The cleanup took considerably longer. When facility security finally arrived, they found the intruders neatly trussed up in the main corridor, looking like they'd been through a particularly aggressive tumble dryer. The cubs sat nearby, looking pleased with themselves, and not at all like they'd just single-handedly prevented a major catastrophe. They saved everyone, Nora told Director Keth later, as medical teams checked over the subdued intruders. All those months when we thought they were being destructive, they were actually trying to protect the other children. We just didn't understand their language. The aftermath brought changes that rippled throughout the entire facility. The cubs were no longer seen as problem cases to be managed, but as valuable members of the community whose unique abilities served everyone's safety. Other species' children began joining the storytelling sessions, drawn by the warmth and acceptance they found there. Vex began speaking regularly, her voice soft but clear, as she asked questions about the stories and occasionally added her own observations. Nix channeled their boundless energy into teaching other children about safety and awareness, turning their hypervigilance into games that helped everyone stay alert without being afraid. And Kal Proud, Protective Kal, became an unofficial mentor to the newer arrivals, helping traumatized children find their place in their new temporary home. The facility director's stress molts decreased dramatically. The night shift staff actually began volunteering for overtime. And somewhere in the depths of space, word began to spread about a human childcare specialist who had revolutionized interspecies youth services through the simple act of telling stories. But for Nora, the most rewarding moment came weeks later, when she found Qual telling stories to a group of newly arrived children, tales of brave hunters who learned that the greatest adventures involved protecting those who needed protection. And so, she heard him say, his young voice carrying the same rhythm and warmth she'd used during those first crucial nights. The pack grew stronger, not by conquering, but by caring, not by dominating, but by defending. And they all lived bravely ever after. As requests for Nora's help began arriving from facilities across the galaxy, each one dealing with their own impossible cases, she realized that sometimes the best solutions weren't found in training manuals or species profiles. Sometimes they were found in the simple recognition that every child, regardless of their species or nature, just wanted to feel safe, understood, and valued for who they truly were. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you discovered that the scariest children just needed someone brave enough to see past their claws and teeth to the vulnerable hearts beating underneath. After all, every predator was someone's baby first.